On the western coast of Greenland, a stone-walled farmstead stands roofless under a grey sky, its byre still holding the shape of stalls where cattle once stood, its church nave open to the weather. No one has lived here in 500 years. The people who built it called themselves Norse, and they had crossed an ocean twice over to reach this place, first from Norway to Iceland, then from Iceland further west, chasing grazing land and driftwood and a wager that the world had more room in it yet. Then, in some winter nobody wrote down, the ships from the homeland stopped arriving, and the farmstead went quiet. That silence is the far end of a story that started 3 centuries earlier, and roughly 2,000 miles to the east, on a beach in Northumbria, where 3 ships appeared out of a clear morning, and a monastery burned before noon. Between that beach and this ruin lies the whole shape of an age, raiding that turned into settling, settling that turned into ruling, and ruling that, in the end, swallowed the raiders whole. This is the entire story of the Viking Age, from the first recorded raid to the quiet unrecorded end of the Norse world at its farthest edge. In a boatyard on a Norwegian fjord, a shipwright named in no surviving record split an oak trunk down its length with iron wedges, working the grain instead of cutting across it so that each plank came away already curved to the shape the hull would need. Radially split oak planks like these, overlapped and riveted edge over edge in a style called clinker-built, could flex with a wave instead of fighting it, and they let a hull sit shallow enough to run up a beach or a river mudflat, and light enough for a crew to portage it around a waterfall, fit a single mast to that hull, hang one broad square sail from it, and by the late 8th century Scandinavia had produced something genuinely new, a vessel that could cross open ocean and still land, unload, and leave again before anyone organised a defence. Archaeologists have recovered actual hulls of this design, ship burials such as the Oseberg and Gokstad finds in Norway, both faithfully clinker-built with a single mast, proof that the sailors who crewed vessels like them had mastered this hull design decades before any Christian chronicler ever wrote down the word for the men who sailed it. The people building these ships were not living in an empty land. Scandinavia's farmland sat in narrow bands. Coastal strips in Norway squeeze between fjord and mountain, Danish plains fertile but finite, Swedish valleys locked behind forest and lake. Norse society ran on a gift economy, in which a chieftain's standing was measured by how much silver, land and loyalty he could hand out to the men sworn to him. A younger son with no inheritance coming or a minor chieftain squeezed out by a stronger neighbour had 2 paths, leave or lose status at home. For centuries those men had gone raiding and trading along their own coasts and each other's. What changed at the end of the 8th century was the ship, and what the ship put within reach. Western Christendom in the 780s and 790s was, from a raider's perspective, an open larder. Monasteries held portable wealth, gold and silver vessels, jewelled bindings, without the standing armies that guarded a king's hall, and the crews now able to reach them did not share the religion or the restraint that had once kept most local warlords from touching sacred ground. Monks kept careful records, unlike most of the societies around the North Sea, so it is largely through Christian chroniclers writing in shock that the first raids survive at all. Historians caution that raiding itself was not new to the North Sea world. What was new was reach, speed and target. There is a scene worth holding on to here because it recurs across the whole age. A longship's crew, perhaps 30 men, each of them a free farmer as much as a fighter, rowing and sailing in shifts, sleeping on deck under leather and wool, carrying barely a week of food because the plan was never to be at sea long. This was not a standing military cast. It was neighbours and cousins pooling a boat, a season, and a gamble. Some of them would not go raiding again after one voyage. Others would keep going until raiding turned into something else entirely, a business, a colony, a kingdom. Both outcomes start from the same beach and the same tide. By the 790s, word of easy plunder along Christian coasts had begun reaching the halls of Scandinavia through returning crews, through traders who moved along the same coasts, and historians believe through mercenaries who had served in Frankish or Anglo-Saxon retinues and seen the wealth up close. The pieces were in place: a hull that could cross the North Sea in 2 or 3 days given a following wind, a social system that rewarded exactly this kind of enterprise, and a set of targets that had not yet learned to defend themselves against it. Nobody in Northumbria or Frankia had any reason yet to expect what was coming. Nobody in Norway or Denmark had any reason to expect how far it would carry them, generations later, from that same stretch of coast to a farmstead on the edge of Greenland and a trading post on a river a continent away. What set the raids in motion then was not a single decision by a single king. It was a match struck between a new kind of ship and an old kind of hunger at a moment when the coasts across the water had grown rich and careless. The first crews to make that crossing did not know they were opening an age. They knew only that the tide was right, the wind was fair, and the water off Northumbria was calm. On the morning of June 8 in the year 793, the monks of Lindisfarne, a tidal island off the coast of Northumbria, were going about the business of a working monastery, copying manuscripts in a scriptorium, tending a small flock of sheep, ringing the bell for the hours of prayer. A contemporary chronicle, written within the same generation, records that 3 ships appeared off the coast that morning, and that the men aboard them killed some of the monks, drove others into the sea, stripped the church of its altar vessels, and left before any defence could be organised. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle called it a disaster and a sign from heaven. Alcuin, an English scholar then living at the court of the Frankish king Charlemagne, wrote a letter home, calling the raid an unprecedented horror, the kind of language that tells us less about the raid itself than about how safe that stretch of coast had felt the day before. Alcuin's letter was addressed to Bishop Higbold, who had presided over the monastery when the ships came ashore, and who now faced the task of consoling a community that had lost brothers and its most sacred ornaments in a single morning. Alcuin asked him directly what sin had brought such a punishment, framing the raid, as many churchmen of the time did, as a judgment from God rather than a worldly event with worldly causes such as ship design or a chieftain's ambition. That religious framing shaped how the raid was written down and remembered for centuries afterward, even as it explained almost nothing about why Scandinavian crews had suddenly become capable of reaching Northumbria at all. Lindisfarne was not undefended by accident. It had stood as one of the most important centres of Christian learning in Britain for more than a century, home to the cult of St. Cuthbert and to illuminated manuscripts whose gold leaf and jewelled bindings made the whole site, in effect, an unguarded treasury. Monasteries across the Christian world had grown wealthy on donations of land, precious metal and manuscripts, while investing almost nothing in walls or warriors, because raiding Christian holy ground from within Christendom itself had until now carried a social and religious cost that kept most local warlords from trying it. Crews arriving from Scandinavia by sea owed that taboo nothing. The raid itself, in the account that survives, was fast and lethal rather than large. Historians estimate the attacking force at no more than a few dozen men, likely the crew of those 3 ships. They did not attempt to hold the island, garrison it, or negotiate. They killed, looted what could be carried, and left on the same tide that brought them. Whether the target was chosen for its wealth, its symbolism, or simple opportunity is not something the sources settle, and modern historians are cautious about reading too much strategy into what may have been an experienced raiding party, recognizing an easy mark. What the raid changed was not England's balance of power. It changed what educated Christian Europe believed was possible. Word of Lindisfarne spread through the same network of monastic letters and chronicles that had, until then, recorded plagues, eclipses, and the deaths of kings as the worst things that happened in a given year. Within the same decade, similar raids struck the monastery at Iona off the coast of Scotland and other coastal religious sites in the British Isles, and chroniclers began using a Latin word borrowed from Old Norse to describe the raiders, a term whose exact origin is debated among historians, but which by most accounts referred to men who went raiding or trading by sea. It matters in tracing this arc forward that Lindisfarne was not an isolated act of savagery from a people otherwise unknown to Christian Europe. Scandinavian traders had been present at ports around the North Sea for generations, and diplomatic and trading contact between Scandinavia and the Frankish and English kingdoms continued throughout the raiding period, sometimes with the very same men who raided one coast trading peacefully on another. The chroniclers who wrote in horror about the raid were not wrong about the violence, but the picture they left behind, of an entirely alien people erupting without warning from the sea, was a simplification even in their own time. Lindisfarne itself would be raided again, more than once over the following decades, until the monastic community finally abandoned the island altogether in 875, carrying the relics of St. Cuthbert inland in a wooden coffin that the monks would not set down again for years. That departure was still 8 decades away in 793. What came first, starting almost immediately, was an escalation. Single ships gave way to fleets, isolated monasteries gave way to river mouths and coastal towns, and the North Sea's other great Christian power, the Frankish Empire of Charlemagne and his heirs began learning the same lesson Northumbria had just learned at far greater cost. On an island called Noirmoutier at the mouth of the Loire River, the monks of a coastal monastery had already been raided so many times by the 840s that when Ermentarius, one of their own brothers, sat down to write an account of it, he described fleets arriving nearly every year, as reliably as the tide that carried them in. The pattern that had begun at Lindisfarne in single ships had become, within 2 generations, an annual expectation along the river mouths of the Frankish Empire, the Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, each one a highway a shallow-drafted longship could climb far inland, well past any coastal watch, straight to the doors of Paris, Rouen and Nantes. Frankish rivers gave raiders something monasteries alone never had: repeatable, defended, high-value targets close enough together that a single fleet could work its way from mouth to source in a season, and shallow enough that the same ship that crossed the North Sea could also reach a city 100 miles from the coast. In 845, a fleet is recorded sailing up the Seine and reaching Paris itself. Rather than fight a battle he judged he could not win, the Frankish king Charles the Bald paid the raiders a sum of silver, by some accounts around £7,000 of it, to leave the city standing and withdraw. Historians treat this payment as the clearest early ancestor of what English chroniclers would later call Danegeld, a Norse loanword into English meaning, roughly, Dane payment, tribute paid not to end a war but to postpone the next raid. The silver that changed hands at Paris in 845 did not move as coin. Much of it travelled as hack silver, cut fragments of jewellery, ingots, and foreign coin melted or chopped down and weighed out on small folding scales that a Norse trader carried in his own kit, because what a Viking crew wanted was weight of metal, not a king's face stamped on it. That same practice of weighing bullion rather than counting coin would follow this silver far to the east, along rivers that ran in the opposite direction from the Seine. The precedent was disastrous in exactly the way such precedents usually are. Paying one fleet to leave told every other fleet on the North Sea and the Baltic that Frankish silver was for sale to whoever showed up with enough ships. Raids on the Seine and Loire continued through the 850s and 860s, and Viking crews began overwintering on islands and river bends inside Frankish territory, instead of sailing home each autumn, building fortified camps that let them raid earlier in the spring than any Frankish army could mobilise to meet them. Paris itself was besieged again far more seriously in 885 and 886, this time for the better part of a year, by a fleet chroniclers put in the hundreds of ships, before the defenders under Count Odo and Bishop Goslin held the city's fortified bridges long enough for a relief force and further tribute to end the siege. By the early 10th century, one particular Viking leader, a man later remembered in Norman tradition as Rollo, had established himself with a substantial force in the lower Seine valley, in the region around Rouen. Rather than face endless further raiding, the Frankish king Charles the Simple negotiated rather than fought. In 911, by the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte, he granted Rollo the territory that would become the Duchy of Normandy, in exchange for Rollo's nominal loyalty and, the sources say, his baptism as a Christian. The name Normandy itself preserves the memory of that settlement, land of the Northmen. This is the shape the raiding age kept repeating on coast after coast, a period of pure extraction, followed by tribute, followed by land granted outright to buy off the raiders, followed within a generation or two by the raiders' own descendants ruling that land as Christian, French-speaking nobles rather than Norse-speaking pagans. Rollo's descendants would, within a century and a half, produce William, Duke of Normandy, whose own conquest of England in 1066 would close the Viking Age on English soil under a banner that no longer called itself Norse at all. Frankia's rivers had taught raiders how to become landlords. England, still absorbing its own fleets through the 860s and 870s, was about to learn the same lesson from a different direction. In the winter of 878, King Alfred of Wessex was not sitting on a throne. He was holed up with a small band of followers in the marshes of Athelney in Somerset, having been driven from his own kingdom by a Viking army that had, over the preceding 13 years, dismantled every other major Anglo-Saxon kingdom in England. From that swamp refuge, Alfred rebuilt a fighting force, and in May of that year he met the Viking leader Guthrum's army at the Battle of Edington, and won decisively enough to dictate terms. It is one of the closer calls in English history, and it marks the point at which the Viking conquest of England stopped rather than continued to its logical end. The army that had brought Alfred to that marsh is remembered in the sources as the Great Heathen Army, a large combined Scandinavian force, likely assembled from several existing warbands that landed in East Anglia in the year 865. Unlike the earlier raiding fleets, this army came to conquer, not to loot and leave. Over the following decade it defeated and effectively ended the independent kingdoms of Northumbria in 867, East Anglia in 869, and most of Mercia by 874, installing puppet rulers or dividing the land outright among its own leaders. By most accounts, the army's most notorious commander was a man named Ivar, sometimes called Ivar the Boneless in later saga tradition. Though historians caution that the sagas were written centuries after the events they describe, and blend memory with legend freely. Wessex in the far south was the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom standing, and it very nearly did not stand. Only after Eddington did the balance shift. Guthrum, defeated, agreed to be baptized a Christian, with Alfred himself standing as his godfather, a diplomatic gesture that folded the Viking leader into the same religious and political order. Alfred represented rather than simply exiling or killing him. The treaty that followed divided England along a rough line running from London to Chester, with Anglo-Saxon law and rule on one side, and what came to be called the Danelaw, Scandinavian custom and settlement, on the other. Place names across eastern and northern England still carry the mark of that division. Towns ending in by and thorpe, Norse words for a farmstead or a settlement, sit thickest in exactly the counties the Danelaw once covered. Alfred did not simply survive the war. He rebuilt Wessex's ability to fight the next one. He established a network of fortified towns called burhs, spaced so that no part of his kingdom lay more than a day's march from a defensible wall, and he restructured the kingdom's military obligations so that a standing force could always be in the field while another worked the land. His successors, his son Edward, and his grandson Athelstan among them, spent the following 2 generations pushing that model outward, retaking Danelaw territory piece by piece, until Athelstan could plausibly be crowned in 927 as king of a single unified England, the first ruler to hold that title over the whole territory. The Danelaw did not simply vanish into English rule at the point of a sword, though. Scandinavian settlers in eastern England had, by the time of Athelstan's conquests, been farming, marrying into local families, and trading in towns like York, which under Norse rule became a major trading hub linking England to Dublin and to the wider Norse world for 2 or 3 generations. What English kings absorbed by the mid-10th century was not a foreign occupying army anymore. It was a population that had already begun to think of itself as English, while keeping its own words for a plough strip, a village, and a husband. Archaeological digs beneath the modern city of York, at a site called Coppergate, have recovered leather shoes, wood-turned bowls, and imported silk fragments from Norse period layers, physical evidence of a town that traded as far as Byzantium and the Islamic caliphates while still governed, for a time, by kings with Norse names such as Guthfrith and Erik Bloodaxe. That trade did not run through England alone. The same Norse merchant networks that filled York's markets ran west to another new Scandinavian foundation on the other side of the Irish Sea, a ship fortress on a river that had grown, by the early 10th century, into the busiest slave market in Western Europe. On the banks of the River Liffey, in the year 841, a Viking fleet established what the Irish annals call a longfort, a fortified ship camp meant to let a raiding force overwinter close to its targets instead of sailing home each autumn. That camp did not fold up in the spring. It grew into Dublin, and within decades it had become one of the busiest and most feared ports in Western Europe, not primarily for gold or silver but for people. Ireland in the 9th century was fractured into dozens of competing petty kingdoms, a political landscape that gave Viking raiders both opportunities and allies. Rival Irish kings frequently hired Norse warbands to fight their own local wars, and Norse leaders frequently married into Irish royal families to secure a claim on the land they had settled. Out of that mixing came a distinct Norse Gaelic culture, neither fully Scandinavian nor fully Irish, centred on Dublin and a handful of other coastal towns including Wexford, Waterford, Cork and Limerick, all of them founded or substantially built up as Viking-era ports. What Dublin traded in more than anything else was captives. Raiding parties took prisoners from Irish farmsteads, monasteries, and, as Norse power reached further, from the coasts of Britain and even the Iberian Peninsula, and marched or shipped them to Dublin's slave market for sale onward, frequently into the Islamic world via trade networks that also ran east through Scandinavia and Russia. Historians estimate that the trade in enslaved captives, thralls in the Norse term, was one of the single largest sources of Viking-era wealth, a business that left far less archaeological trace than a silver hoard or a burned monastery, but that shaped, more than almost anything else, how Irish and English chroniclers of the time wrote about their raiders. Dublin's Norse rulers did not stay pagan outsiders forever. By the late 10th century, kings such as Sitric Silkbeard, who ruled Dublin into the 1030s, had converted to Christianity and were commissioning church buildings. Sitric himself is credited with founding what became Christ Church Cathedral, while still commanding fleets and alliances that operated by the old rules of raid and tribute. That double identity, Christian king and Viking warlord in the same person, came to a head in 1014 at the Battle of Clontarf, where the Irish High King Brian Boris forces defeated a combined army of the Dublin Norse and their Irish allies from Leinster, though Brian himself was killed in the fighting after the battle had already turned. Clontarf did not expel the Norse from Ireland. Dublin remained a Norse-ruled trading city for another century and a half, but the battle is remembered, by most accounts, as the moment Irish power definitively checked any further Viking territorial expansion on the island. What Dublin left behind outlasted its Norse kings by many centuries. A walled trading town at a river mouth laid out on a Scandinavian model that Anglo-Norman conquerors would later inherit almost intact when they took the city in 1170, and that grew, over the following centuries, into Ireland's capital, the same pattern that turned a Loire river camp into Normandy and a Seine city into Rouen had turned an Irish ship camp into a European capital, proof that the most durable thing a raiding fleet ever built was rarely the raid itself, but the town it left standing afterward. Not every Norse family arriving in the Irish sea world found land or standing waiting for them either. Dublin, York, and the Scottish Isles were already claimed by established warlords by the middle of the 9th century, and a farmer or a minor chieftain's son, arriving late to that competition, had little to gain by fighting established Norse rivals for scraps of Irish or English coastline. Some of those latecomers turned their ships further out into open ocean, toward islands the sailors of their own grandparents' generation had said no one had yet settled at all. When the first Norse ships nosed into Icelandic bays in the 870s, according to the saga tradition recorded centuries later in the Landnámabók, or Book of Settlements, the land they found had no people on it at all, only a handful of Irish monks who left rather than share the island with newcomers, and everywhere the settlers looked, birch, scrub and undergrowth rather than forest. The traditional first settler, a chieftain named Ingolfur Arnarsson, is said to have thrown the carved wooden pillars of his high seat overboard as his ship approached and vowed to build his farm, wherever the tide carried them ashore, a story historians treat as legend rather than verified fact, though it captures accurately enough the mix of ritual and improvisation with which Iceland was actually settled. Iceland's appeal was not gold. It was simply unclaimed land, at a moment when Norway's own farmland was fully divided among established families, and a king named Harald Fairhair was, by tradition, consolidating scattered Norwegian chieftaincies into something closer to a single kingdom, a process that pushed some defeated or unwilling chieftains to look for territory where no king could yet reach them. Historians debate how much weight to put on flight from Harald's consolidation as a cause of the Icelandic settlement versus simple land hunger and opportunity, and the evidence supports both motives operating at once. Within roughly 60 years, by around 930, most of Iceland's habitable coastal and valley land had been claimed and divided among an estimated several thousand settlers and their households, including, alongside Norse settlers, a significant number of people of Gaelic origin from Ireland and Scotland, some free, some brought as thralls. What Iceland's settlers built instead of a monarchy was something closer to a confederation of independent farms, organised around local assemblies, and, from 930 onward, a single annual General Assembly called the Althing, held at a site called Thingvellir, where a dramatic volcanic rift valley provided both a natural amphitheatre for public speaking and a boundary marker for the island's political geography. The Althing had no king to enforce its rulings and no standing army. Its authority rested on public recitation of the law by an elected law speaker who was required to memorise and recite the entire legal code from a rocky platform called the Law Rock over the course of 3 successive assemblies, and on the willingness of powerful local chieftains, called Godar, to back its judgments with their own followers when a dispute demanded enforcement. This decentralised system produced neither chaos nor peace exactly, but something durable, a written legal culture, an oral tradition that would eventually produce the Sagas, some of the richest narrative literature to survive from medieval Europe, and a settlement whose Norse and Gaelic settlers gradually stopped identifying as either and started identifying simply as Icelandic. The system also required constant maintenance. Blood feuds between families, arising over land boundaries, insults or inheritance, were common enough that a large share of surviving Icelandic law concerns exactly how compensation for a killing should be calculated and paid, a legal culture built less around preventing violence outright than around channeling it into a process the whole community could recognise as settled once concluded. The island's environment set hard limits on that success from the start. Icelandic soil, once its thin cover of birch scrub was cleared for farmland and grazing, eroded quickly in the island's volcanic climate, and within a few generations, settlers were already cutting far more timber and turf than the land could regrow, a slow-motion resource strain that would matter more as centuries passed than any single raid or battle ever had. Iceland's settlers had crossed open ocean farther than any Norse fleet before them, and found land waiting with no one to fight for it. That same appetite for unclaimed coastline, once Iceland itself filled up, would carry the next generation of restless younger sons even further west, past a second, harsher island of ice and rock, and eventually to a coastline no European had ever recorded seeing before. Far to the east of Dublin and Iceland, on a river system Norse traders used to link the Baltic Sea to the Caspian and the Black Sea, a wholly different kind of Viking Age was unfolding, one built on trade routes rather than raiding fleets. Norse merchants and warrior traders, known in the Eastern Chronicles as the Rus, a name whose exact origin scholars debate, but which may derive from a Norse word for men who rode, established trading posts along the Volga and Dnieper rivers beginning in the mid-9th century, at sites including Staraya Ladoga near the Baltic coast and, further south, Novgorod and eventually Kiev. These rivers were the eastern equivalent of the Seine and the Loire, highways into a wealthy interior, except that instead of Frankish monasteries, what lay at the far end was the Islamic world's flow of silver, minted as dirhams by the Abbasid Caliphate and its neighbours, arriving in staggering quantities via trade in furs, honey, wax and enslaved people captured from Slavic and Finnic populations along the route. Archaeologists have recovered hoards containing tens of thousands of Islamic silver dirhams across Scandinavia, particularly on the Baltic island of Gotland, physical proof of just how much of that eastern silver eventually made its way home. The same folding bronze scales and cut hack silver fragments that had weighed out Frankish tribute on the scene turn up in eastern hoards too, because a Rus trader cared about the weight of metal in his pouch, not which king's face happened to be stamped on any given coin. The Rus did not simply pass through this world as outsiders. According to the primary chronicle, an early medieval Slavic history, written centuries after the events it describes, feuding Slavic and Finnic tribes around Novgorod invited a Rus leader named Rurik to rule over them around the year 862, an account historians treat with real caution given how much later it was written, and how convenient a founding legend it makes for the ruling dynasty that later claimed descent from him. Whatever the precise truth of that invitation, a Rus ruling class did establish itself over the following decades across a growing network of river towns, and by 882 a leader remembered as Oleg had extended that rule south to Kiev, founding what later history calls Kievan Rus, the state from which modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus all trace part of their political origin. Further south still, the Rus reached the wealthiest city either they or most of Christian Europe had ever seen, Constantinople, which Norse sources called Miklagard, the great city, capital of the Byzantine Empire, and a metropolis of perhaps 500,000 people at a time when the largest town in Scandinavia held a few thousand. Rus fleets raided Byzantine territory more than once, with mixed results, but trade proved more durable than conquest. By the late 10th century, Norse and Rus warriors were serving as an elite mercenary corps for the Byzantine emperors themselves, a unit later known as the Varangian Guard, whose members are recorded carving runic graffiti into the marble of Byzantine buildings, including, according to long tradition, into a balustrade in the Hagia Sophia itself, a single scratched name left by a bored guardsman 1,000 years before anyone thought to look for it. The Arab traveller and diplomat Ibn Fadlan, journeying along the Volga in the year 921 as part of a caliphal embassy, left one of the most detailed outside accounts of Rus customs to survive from the period, describing their tattoos, their trade in captives, and their funeral rites in careful, curious, occasionally horrified prose, evidence that the Russes were, to the wealthy and literate societies they traded with, exotic northern strangers rather than the desperate raiders of the western sagas. His account, preserved through later Arabic manuscripts, remains one of the very few outside descriptions of Rus daily life, written by someone who claimed to have witnessed it directly rather than heard it second-hand. Within a few generations, this eastern branch of the Norse world would follow a pattern already visible on every other coast the longships had reached, absorbed by conversion and intermarriage into the Slavic culture around it far more completely and far faster than any Western Viking colony ever was. A story the sagas barely touch, and that survives instead in a different set of chronicles altogether. Erik Thorvaldsson, a fiery-tempered Norwegian settler better remembered by his epithet Erik the Red, was exiled from Iceland around the year 982 after killing several men in a series of feuds, the kind of violent, spiralling dispute the sagas describe as an ordinary hazard of Icelandic settler life. Banished for 3 years, he sailed west rather than east, into waters where Icelandic sailors had glimpsed land but never settled, and spent his exile exploring a coastline of fjords, grassland, and glacier that he named, with a salesman's instinct rather than strict accuracy, Greenland, reasoning, according to the sagas, that a good name would draw settlers more effectively than an honest one. It worked. Erik returned to Iceland once his exile ended, recruited settlers with tales of good grazing land, and led a fleet of roughly 25 ships west around 985, of which about 14 are said to have survived the crossing. The colony he founded split into 2 main settlements along Greenland's southwestern coast. The eastern and western settlements, built around turf and stone longhouses much like those in Iceland and Norway, raising sheep, goats and cattle on grassland that, in the medieval warm period then prevailing, supported farming far closer to the Arctic Circle than would be possible today. At its height, the Greenland colony likely held several thousand people, a bishop's seat, a cathedral at a site called Gardar, and regular trading contact with Norway and Iceland, exporting walrus ivory, furs and live falcons in exchange for timber and iron that Greenland's own landscape could not supply. Erik's son Leif Erikson pushed the exploration further. According to the sagas, around the year 1000 Leif sailed west from Greenland and became the first European known to reach the coast of North America, landing at a place the sagas call Vinland, meaning wineland, apparently for wild grapes or berries the explorers found growing there. For most of the last century, historians treated Vinland as pure legend. That changed in 1960, when archaeologists excavating a site called Lanseorgs Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland uncovered the remains of Norse-style turf buildings, iron rivets from ship repair, and a soapstone spindle whirl, physical, undeniable proof that Norse settlers had reached North America roughly 500 years before Columbus' voyage, even if the site itself was likely only one of several short-lived camps rather than Vinland's full extent. The Norse who reached Vinland did not stay. The sagas describe repeated encounters, sometimes trading, sometimes violent, with indigenous peoples the Norse called Skraelings, a term whose exact meaning is debated but which the sagas use for the indigenous groups the settlers met, likely ancestors of the Beothuk, Micmac or related peoples of the region. Outnumbered, far from any resupply, and by the saga's own account, unable to hold the peace with the people already living there, the Vinland settlers abandoned their camps after only a handful of years, leaving North America to be reached by Europeans again only after 5 more centuries had passed. Greenland's colony, founded on the same wave of exploration, proved far more durable, in part simply because it was closer to home and, unlike Vinland, empty of any rival population large enough to contest it when the Norse first arrived. Norway's own kings took notice of this westward reach. By the 13th century, Greenland and Iceland had both formally submitted to the Norwegian crown, drawn into the same tax and trade system that governed the homeland, a bureaucratic tie that bound Greenland's fate, for better and worse, to decisions made an ocean away in ports it could take weeks or months to reach. What Vinland proves about the wider Viking Age is not that the Norse conquered a continent, because they plainly did not, but how far the same restless combination of ship technology, land hunger, and tolerance for genuine risk that had carried longships to Northumbria 2 centuries earlier could still carry a crew, at the very edge of that same age, clear across an ocean most of medieval Europe did not yet know existed. Greenland, though, sitting at the true edge of what that ship technology and that style of farming could sustain, would prove to be where the age's outward reach finally met a limit it could not outsail. By the time Cnut became King of England in 1016, the tribute money that had once bought off individual raiding fleets had become something closer to a national tax. English kings had been levying a payment called Danegeld army tax for years to fund defence, and, when defence failed, to pay off Danish fleets directly, and by most accounts the sums involved by the early 11th century ran into tens of thousands of pounds of silver, extracted from the English population repeatedly over more than 2 decades. Cnut, son of the Danish king Svein Forkbeard, inherited both the crown his father had briefly seized and the tribute machinery the English state had built to survive Viking raids, and he turned that machinery to entirely new uses. Cnut's rule marked less an escalation of raiding than its conversion into sustained government. He maintained a standing fleet and a personal bodyguard of household troops called the Thingmen, paid for out of continued English taxation, and he used that force not primarily to raid but to hold together what historians call the North Sea Empire, a personal union under one king of England, Denmark, and, for a time after 1028, Norway as well. This was the raiding economy's logical endpoint. Instead of Scandinavian fleets extracting silver from England in episodic strikes, a Scandinavian king now governed England directly and used its wealth, alongside Denmark's and Norway's, to fund a single unified court and military system spanning 3 kingdoms and the sea between them. Cnut worked deliberately to present himself as a legitimate Christian king rather than a conqueror, in a pattern that echoed Rollo in Normandy and Guthrum in the Danelaw before him. He confirmed and, in places, strengthened existing English law codes, patronised the English church generously, and undertook a pilgrimage to Rome in 1027 to attend the coronation of the Holy Roman Emperor. Writing home a letter describing the honours shown him by the Pope and other rulers, a document historians read as a deliberate piece of political messaging aimed at English and Scandinavian audiences alike. A well-known story, first recorded generations after his reign, has Cnut ordering the incoming tide to halt at his command and then, when it obeyed no king, using the failure to demonstrate to his flattering courtiers that even a king as powerful as he had limits set by God alone. Historians treat the tale as a later moral parable rather than a recorded event, though it endured for centuries precisely because it captured something contemporaries recognised in how Cnut actually ruled. A conqueror working hard to be remembered as a legitimate, humble Christian king rather than a Viking overlord. The North Sea Empire did not outlive Cnut by long. He died in 1035, and within 7 years his sons had failed to hold the union together. Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut split and then lost England, and by 1042 the English throne had passed back to a native Anglo-Saxon king, Edward the Confessor, ending direct Danish rule over England. Denmark and Norway, meanwhile, went their own separate ways under their own royal lines. Cnut's court itself, while it lasted, drew heavily on skalds, Norse court poets, whose praise poems for him survive in fragments, and describe a ruler who moved as easily between an English cathedral dedication and a Danish war fleet's muster as any monarch of the age managed to. What Cnut's brief empire had proved, though, was that the age's most successful Scandinavian rulers by the 11th century were no longer raiders looking for plunder. They were kings competing for the same kind of Christian, tax-funded, centrally administered rule that the rest of Europe already practiced, using tools, and often the very silver, that 2 centuries of raiding had first put into Scandinavian hands. That shift from raider to administrator did not begin with Cnut, and it did not end with him. It had been underway in Denmark and Norway for 2 generations already, driven not by a single king's ambition but by conversion itself, a decision that reshaped Scandinavian society more thoroughly than any single battle or treaty in the raiding age had managed to. At Jelling in central Denmark stands a runestone raised, according to its own inscription, by King Harald Bluetooth in memory of his father Gorm and his mother Thyra, a stone that calls Harald the King, who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. It is, in effect, a monument that converts itself as you read it, an old form, the carved runic memorial stone that Norse chieftains had raised for generations to boast of conquests and honour ancestors, now carrying an entirely new message that the age of the old gods in Denmark was over by royal decree. Harald's conversion, traditionally dated to around 965, followed a pattern that would repeat across Scandinavia over the following 2 generations. not a grassroots religious movement but a political decision by a ruler who recognized that Christianity offered access to the diplomatic, legal, and administrative machinery of the rest of Europe, machinery built by and for Christian kings. A pagan Danish king could raid Christian coasts. A Christian Danish king could marry into Christian royal families, correspond with the Pope, and claim the same divine sanction for his rule that every other monarch in Western Europe already claimed for theirs. Norway's conversion came harder and later, and cost more blood. Olaf Tryggvason, who seized the Norwegian throne in 995, pursued Christianization by direct force where persuasion failed, destroying pagan temples, and according to saga accounts that historians treat with some caution given how they flatter later Christian kings, punishing or exiling chieftains who refused baptism. Olaf died in battle in the year 1000, and Norway's old religion outlasted him by another 15 years, till a second king, also named Olaf, Olaf Haraldsson, resumed the campaign with similarly forceful methods. Olaf Haraldsson was killed in battle at Stiklestad in 1030 by a coalition of Norwegian chieftains, who resented his methods, his taxes, or both, but within a year miracles were already being reported at his grave, and the Norwegian church swiftly canonized him as Saint Olaf, transforming a deposed and violently unpopular king into Norway's patron saint, and the permanent religious foundation of the kingdom he had failed to hold in life. Iceland's conversion, by contrast, happened almost entirely without bloodshed, through the same institution that had governed the island since 930. At the Althing in the year 1000, with Christian and pagan chieftains reportedly on the verge of open conflict, the assembly's law speaker, a pagan named Thorgeir, withdrew alone under a cloak for a day and a night to consider the matter, then emerged and ruled that Iceland would adopt Christianity as its official religion, while permitting private unsupervised worship of the old gods, along with certain older Norse customs, to continue for a further unspecified period before ending. Historians view this arrangement, however historically dressed up in later retelling, as a genuinely pragmatic legal compromise, less a religious conversion than a deliberate choice to avoid civil war, by settling the question through the same assembly-based process. Icelanders used to settle every other dispute. Across Scandinavia, conversion changed more than which god a farmer prayed to. It brought literacy in the Latin alphabet, church-run record-keeping, bishops with their own political weight, and, within a generation or two in every kingdom, the slow decline of the runestone itself as the primary way a family memorialized its dead. Some of the last runestones raised in Denmark and Sweden, in the 11th and even 12th centuries, carry both a pagan-style carved dragon or serpent border and an explicitly Christian cross at the centre, a single stone recording, in its own design, the exact moment one religious world gave way to another. The Norse gods did not disappear from memory. They disappeared from state religion and from the halls of kings who now needed the rest of Christian Europe to recognize them as legitimate rulers, rather than pagan warlords who happened to hold a crown. By the middle of the 11th century, a Norwegian or Danish chieftain hoping to build a fortune no longer looked first to a longship and an unguarded coastline. He looked to a king's court, a church appointment, or a share in one of the increasingly formal tax systems that Scandinavian monarchies had spent the previous century building. The raiding economy that had funded Norse expansion from Lindisfarne to Constantinople had not been outlawed so much as outcompeted, replaced by revenue streams that required no ship crossing and no risk of a foreign king's army waiting on the beach. Centralized kingship in Denmark, Norway and Sweden developed unevenly but along broadly similar lines across the 10th and 11th centuries, a single royal line establishing lasting control over territory that had previously answered to dozens of independent local chieftains, backed by a church hierarchy that collected its own revenue through tithes and land grants, and that in turn lent the crown religious legitimacy no pagan warlord could claim. Kings began minting their own coinage rather than relying on cut and weighed hacksilver, a shift that sounds administrative but carried real weight. A coin stamped with a king's face and guaranteed weight was a small, constant assertion of royal authority every time it changed hands, in a way a chopped fragment of foreign silver never was. This consolidation did not happen without resistance or without violence. Local chieftains who had built their standing on the old gift economy, on raiding plunder handed out to loyal followers, had every reason to resist a king who wanted to tax them instead of reward them, and Scandinavian history through the 11th and 12th centuries is dense with civil wars, rival claimants, and assassinated kings as the new centralised model fought to displace the old decentralised one. Norway alone endured a long stretch of civil conflict in the 12th century, sometimes called the Civil War era, largely over exactly this question of who had the legitimate right to collect what had once been a chieftain's raiding income and was now a king's tax base. The church played a quieter but equally decisive role in this shift. Bishops, who answered to Rome and to their own sees rather than to any single chieftain's household, became landholders and lawgivers in their own right, and cathedral schools began training a small literate class of clergy and royal officials who could keep written land records, tax rolls, and law codes in a way no purely oral chieftaincy ever had. A kingdom that could write down who owed what to whom no longer depended entirely on a chieftain's memory or his sword to enforce it. The last large-scale Viking-style raiding expeditions against Western Europe, as opposed to Scandinavian dynastic wars fought closer to home, wound down across the mid-11th century, not because the ships or the sailors had disappeared, but because the targets had changed. English, Frankish and German kingdoms by this point maintained standing defensive forces, fortified towns, and diplomatic and marriage ties to Scandinavian royal houses that made casual raiding both harder to carry out and less socially acceptable among rulers who now saw each other as fellow Christian monarchs rather than rival pagan or half-converted warlords. A Danish or Norwegian king in 1050 had far more to lose in reputation and in alliance from raiding a neighbouring Christian kingdom than his grandfather had ever had to lose from raiding a monastery in 830. What replaced raiding for the ambitious younger sons who had once filled a longship's benches were the ordinary channels of medieval European power. Crusading expeditions organised under church sanction rather than private profit, mercenary service in the pay of foreign kings, marriage alliances, and, for the less fortunate, simply farming the land their fathers had settled a century or two before. The Viking Age did not end in a single battle or a single treaty. It ended the way most ages of upheaval end, through the slow, unglamorous work of institutions finally catching up with the disruption that had outrun them for 2.5 centuries. One battle, though, coming within a generation of this quiet consolidation, would still manage to feel like the age's true and final military reckoning, and it would arrive on English soil in the same autumn that produced the most famous conquest in English history. On September 25, 1066, near a river crossing called Stamford Bridge outside York, King Harold Godwinson of England force-marched an army nearly 200 miles in 4 days to catch a Norwegian invasion force by surprise, still resting after a victory days earlier and, by the account in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, caught without most of their armour, which had been left back at their ships. The battle that followed was brutal and decisive. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway and one of the last great Viking-style warlords of the age, was killed by an arrow through the throat, and the invasion force he had led, reduced from perhaps 300 ships to a remnant that reportedly required only 24 or so to carry the survivors home, was effectively destroyed. Harald Hardrada's career before that final battle read like a summary of everything the Viking Age had by then become. He had fought as a young exile in Kievan Rus, served in the Byzantine Varangian Guard in campaigns across the Mediterranean and Sicily, married a Rus princess, and returned to Norway to claim its throne through years of warfare, before finally, in 1066, launching one last attempt at outright conquest, this time of England itself, based on a distant and contested claim to the English crown through an earlier Scandinavian king. He was, by most historians' judgment, attempting exactly what Cnut had achieved a half-century earlier, and what Rollo's descendants were, at that very moment, also attempting from the opposite direction. Those descendants were the second half of the story that same autumn. Duke William of Normandy, ruler of a duchy founded a century and a half earlier, when the Frankish crown granted land to the Viking leader Rollo in exchange for peace, landed his own invasion force on the south coast of England only 3 days after Stamford Bridge, while Harold's exhausted army was still marching north to fight one Scandinavian claimant. Harold turned his army around and marched it south again, covering the length of England twice within a matter of weeks, and met William's forces at Hastings on October 14, where Harold was killed and his army broken, opening England to Norman conquest. The irony sits close to the surface of these two battles fought within 3 weeks of each other on the same island. Harold Godwinson defeated a Norse king descended from the old raiding tradition in its most direct form, only to lose his kingdom days later and utterly exhausted to a duke whose own great-great-great-grandfather had been exactly that kind of Norse raider 2 centuries earlier, before conquest, treaty, and 3 generations of intermarriage with Frankish nobility, had turned his descendants into French-speaking Christian aristocrats, who no longer thought of themselves as Norse at all. England's Viking Age effectively ended in 1066, not because Vikings stopped trying to take it. Harald Hardrada's invasion proves they had not, but because the winning invader that year was already several generations removed from anything resembling a longship crew, arriving instead with mounted knights, feudal land grants, and a claim to the throne validated by the Pope rather than by any Norse god of war. Historians are careful not to overstate 1066 as a clean historical hinge. Scandinavian kings would make further smaller attempts on English and Scottish territory in the following decades, and Norse settlement in the Orkney and Shetland Islands, and in parts of Scotland and the Isle of Man, continued under Norse-descended earls for centuries afterward, some of them not passing formally to Scottish crown control until as late as the 15th century, but as a contest for the English crown decided by force of arms between rival claimants of genuinely Norse and genuinely Norman character. Stamford Bridge and Hastings together mark, as clearly as any single autumn can, the point where the military Viking Age on English soil came to its close. In 988, a Rus prince named Vladimir, ruler of Kiev and by ancestry, descended from the Scandinavian founders the primary chronicle credits, with establishing Rus rule over the region more than a century earlier, adopted Orthodox Christianity from the Byzantine Empire as the official religion of his realm reportedly after his envoys, sent to survey the major faiths available to him, returned overwhelmed by the splendour of a service in Constantinople's Hagia Sophia. The conversion, whatever mix of genuine conviction and political calculation drove it, tied Kievan Rus permanently to the Byzantine cultural and religious world rather than to the Latin Christian world that Scandinavia itself was converting to at almost the same decades, and it set the eastern branch of the Viking Age on a cultural path that would diverge sharply from its western cousins. Vladimir's descendants continued to bear names that mixed Norse and Slavic origins for a generation or two. His son Yaroslav, who ruled Kiev through the mid-11th century, and whose reign is remembered as a high point of Kievan Rus culture, law and church building, married his own children into royal families across Christian Europe, from France to Norway to Byzantium, evidence of a ruling dynasty still very much plugged into a wider Norse-descended aristocratic network, even as its own subjects and its own court increasingly spoke and thought in Old East Slavic rather than Old Norse. By Yaroslav's time, barely 2 centuries after the semi-legendary Rurik's arrival, the ruling elite of Kievan Rus had become, in language, religion and daily custom, essentially indistinguishable from the Slavic populations they governed. This assimilation happened faster and more completely than in almost any other Norse settlement of the age, for reasons historians link to simple demographics. The Rus who settled along the Volga and Dnieper arrived as a comparatively small warrior and merchant elite governing a vastly larger Slavic and Finnic population. Unlike Iceland, where Norse settlers arrived in numbers large enough to remain the demographic majority, or Normandy, where Norse settlers, though a minority, retained enough independent power for generations to shape the surrounding culture as much as be shaped by it. In Rus territory, intermarriage, court administration, and everyday trade all ran through the existing Slavic-speaking population from the start, and by the 12th century Norse personal names had all but disappeared from the Rus princely line, replaced by Slavic names such as Vladimir, Yaroslav and Vsevolod. The Varangian Guard in Byzantium likewise thinned over the same period, not through any single event but through the same slow demographic tide. Fewer new recruits arrived directly from Scandinavia, as the old raiding and trading routes that had once funneled ambitious young Norse warriors east lost their appeal compared to opportunities now available closer to home in newly centralized Scandinavian kingdoms, and the unit increasingly recruited from other populations, including eventually Anglo-Saxon exiles displaced by the Norman conquest, a strange historical loop in which the descendants of England's own conquered nobility ended up guarding a Byzantine emperor's palace using a title first earned by Norse warriors 2 centuries before. The river towns themselves outlived every trace of the traders who founded them as a distinct people. Novgorod grew into a major medieval trading republic in its own right, and Kiev remained a centre of Slavic Orthodox culture for centuries after the last Rus prince, who could plausibly have traced his line to a Scandinavian founder had died. What the eastern branch of the Viking Age left behind was not a Norse kingdom that survived to the present day, the way Iceland did, nor a Norse-founded duchy that changed the course of English history, the way Normandy did. It left a name. Rus became Russia, an origin still debated by historians and occasionally invoked in modern political arguments about who has the deeper claim to Slavic history, but a genuine linguistic fossil of a Scandinavian trading network that vanished into the population it once ruled far more thoroughly and far faster than any of its Western counterparts. The Halsey Church, a roofless stone shell standing at the head of a Greenland fjord, is the site of the last written record of the Norse Greenland colony, a wedding celebrated there in September of 1408 between an Icelandic sea captain named Thorstein Olafsson and a local woman named Sigrid Bjornsdottir, recorded because the witnesses later needed to prove the marriage had taken place after Thorstein returned to Iceland years later. After that entry, the documentary trail simply stops. No further ship's log, church letter, or royal decree mentions the Greenland Norse again, and when European explorers eventually returned to the same fjords in the 16th and 17th centuries, they found only ruins exactly like the one this whole story opened with. What happened to the Greenland colony in the 2 or 3 centuries between its founding by Erik the Red and its last recorded wedding is genuinely contested among historians, and the honest answer is that several pressures likely compounded rather than any single cause explaining the end outright. The medieval warm period that had made Greenland farming viable in the 980s gave way, from around the start of the 14th century, to a centuries-long global cooling trend known as the Little Ice Age, and ice core and sediment evidence from Greenland itself shows summers growing shorter and colder across exactly this window, squeezing the hay harvest a Norse farmer needed to keep livestock alive through the winter. Trade links that had sustained the colony also frayed. Norway itself was struck hard by the Black Death starting in 1349, losing, by some estimates, close to half its population and with it much of the shipping capacity and demand that had once made the long, dangerous voyage to Greenland worth undertaking regularly. Greenland's main export, walrus ivory, had also lost much of its market value in Europe by the 14th century as increased contact with North Africa and the Mediterranean brought cheaper, larger elephant ivory within reach of European buyers, undercutting the one commodity that had justified the trip in the first place, a colony that depended entirely on ships arriving from Norway for timber, iron, and news found those ships arriving less and less often, until, by some accounts, they may have stopped coming at all decades before the colony itself disappeared. The Norse were also, by this period, not alone on Greenland's coast. Thule Inuit populations migrating south and east across the Arctic over these same centuries had reached the same fjords the Norse western and eastern settlements occupied, and archaeological evidence shows both trade and, at times, conflict between the two peoples, though the exact balance between cooperation and hostility, and how much either contributed to the Norse colony's end, remains a matter of real historical debate rather than settled fact. Excavated middens, the layered refuse heaps beside Old Norse farms, show a diet shifting over the centuries from cattle and sheep towards seal and fish, and skeletons from the colony's final generations show clear signs of malnutrition, evidence that the Greenland Norse were adapting to a harsher land right up until the point they could no longer adapt fast enough. The western settlement, the smaller of the two, appears to have been abandoned first, sometime in the 14th century, well before the last written record from the eastern settlement. By the time the eastern settlement itself went silent, likely sometime in the 15th century, though the exact date is unknown, the population had almost certainly dwindled gradually, rather than vanished all at once, through emigration back to Iceland and Norway, through death from cold and hunger, and historians now increasingly believe through slow absorption in some cases into neighbouring Inuit communities, rather than through the single dramatic catastrophe, a massacre or a plague, that earlier generations of historians once favoured as an explanation. Greenland's Norse colony did not fall. It thinned generation by generation until there were too few people left to keep a church roofed or a ship's log written, and the fjord simply grew quiet. In Iceland, in the early 13th century, a chieftain, historian and poet named Snorri Sturluson sat down to write, in the same language his own ancestors had spoken when they first crossed to the island 4 centuries earlier, an account of the kings, gods and voyages of an age that had, by his own lifetime already fully ended. Snorri's works, including a history of Norwegian kings called Heimskringla and a handbook of poetic myth called the Prose Edda, along with the many family sagas written by other, mostly anonymous Icelandic authors across the following century, are the reason a modern audience can name Ivar, Erik the Red, and Harald Hardrada at all. Almost none of what is remembered about the Viking Age as a lived, textured world, arguments at a feast, the shape of a settlement dispute, the exact wording of an insult that started a blood feud, survives from the age itself. It survives because Icelanders, 2 and 3 centuries after the raids at Lindisfarne and the wedding at Walsey, decided their grandparents' world was worth writing down before it finished slipping out of living memory. That timing matters. The sagas were written by Christian, literate Icelanders describing a pagan oral tradition world their own great-grandparents had already left behind, which means every raid, every voyage, and every feud in them passed through at least 2 centuries of retelling before anyone set it on parchment. Historians treat the sagas as invaluable and unreliable in the same breath. Invaluable because no other source captures the texture of Norse daily life and belief in anything like the same detail. Unreliable because names, dates, and even entire episodes were shaped, embellished, or invented outright by authors working within their own centuries' literary conventions and political interests. The sagas are not a transcript of the Viking Age. They are that age's afterlife, written by people who were already living in the kingdoms and churches that had replaced it. Consider what actually closes by the time Snorri picks up his pen. The ships that made the age possible had not vanished. Norwegian and Icelandic sailors still built and sailed clinker-hulled vessels for centuries afterward, but they no longer carried raiding crews to undefended coastlines because there were no undefended Christian coastlines left in Western Europe for them to find. The silver that had once been weighed out, hacked and foreign, on a folding scale had given way to minted royal coinage, stamped with the faces of Christian kings whose grandfathers those same coins had once been paid to. And the rune stones that chieftains once raised to boast of their own raiding and conquest had, one by one across 2 centuries, given way first to Christian crosses carved into the same stone, and then to church walls and stone crosses that needed no runic inscription at all, because the people reading them now had priests, bishops, and written law to record what mattered instead. The Viking Age did not end because Norse people stopped existing, or stopped sailing, or stopped fighting. It ended because every single frontier that had made raiding, trading, and settling possible, ungoverned coastlines, an open silver economy outside any king's control, land nobody yet claimed, closed one after another, in Northumbria, in Frankia, in Ireland, in the rivers of the Rus, and finally, slowest of all, on the cold coast of Greenland. What began as a handful of ships taking advantage of a moment when the ship had outrun the defences of an entire continent ended as kingdoms, built in no small part on the wealth and confidence those same ships had won, that no longer needed raiding to survive and could no longer tolerate it either. The age closed itself, coastline by coastline, silver hoard by silver hoard, using the exact same tools it had opened with. Somewhere beneath the turf near that roofless farmstead on Greenland's coast, archaeologists have found a small hoard of silver coins minted in Norway that someone buried and never came back to dig up. No one knows why. Perhaps the winter that took them came too fast, or the ship that was meant to carry word, or a return voyage, never arrived at all. The coins themselves are unremarkable, worn thin from handling, the kind of currency a farmer might have set aside for a trade that, in the end, never happened. They are not so different, in the end, from the silver once weighed out on a folding scale to save Paris, or paid to buy off an English coastline, or carried east along a river to a caliph's mint and back again as a chieftain's fortune. Every hoard like this one across the Norse world tells the same small story at a different scale. Wealth moved, was counted, was buried against a need that either came too late or never came at all. This particular hoard simply happened to be the last one, buried at the last settlement, at the far edge of a world that 3 centuries of ships, silver and hunger for open land had built outward from a single fjord in Norway. The coins sat in the frozen ground for roughly 500 years, through the centuries when the rest of Europe forgot Greenland had ever been Norse at all, until a spade finally turned them up again and put them, quietly, back into a story that had started far earlier and far away, on a June morning when 3 ships came out of a clear sky toward an island that had never once thought it needed a wall.